The Safari Zone used to be one of the mainstays of the Pokémon games, being featured in almost every entry until Gen 5 with Black and White. And it is not hard to see why. Here's a giant area full of Pokémon, here's a bunch of Pokéballs, have fun! The Safari Zone went through adjustments, improvements, and reworks with each game and remake. But what are all these changes exactly? How do the core mechanics of each incarnation of the Safari Zone work? And most importantly, why was such a staple of the series completely removed? Let's find out together. Located in Pokémon Red and Blue's Fuchsia City, the very first Safari Zone is available to us as soon as we enter the town. For a fee of 500 flag with 2 lines, we are given 30 Safari Balls and are free to use them in the 4 areas that compose the Safari Zone: the Center Area, Area 2, and Area 3. It turns out the sign in Area 1 mistakenly indicates we are in the Center Area. Our Safari time is limited to 500 steps, or whenever we run out of Safari Balls. 500 steps is barely enough to explore all 4 areas and pick up the numerous items littered all over. In fact, the Safari Zone is not an optional area in Gen 1, as we need to find the gold teeth, which are exchanged for the HM strength in Fuchsia City, and the Sacred House in Area 3, where we are given the HM Surf, both HMs being mandatory to continue the story. But what about the main attraction? The Pokémon. Every area has varying encounter rates, but the Pokémon we find are a mixture of Nidoran and its evolutions, bug, grass, and normal types, and if we have fishing rods, water types, with a couple of exceptions. Most of the Pokémon we can capture in the Safari Zone can be obtained in other areas of the game, or purchased for coins in the Celadon Game Corner, except for Execute, Rhyhorn, Kangaskhan, and Tauros, exclusives to the Safari Zone. To catch these rare specimens, we have to deal with the unique way encounters work here. In the Safari Zone, there is no Pokémon combat. We are instead given the option of throwing a Safari Ball, some bait that will make the Pokémon less likely to flee, but harder to capture, and a rock that will make the Pokémon more likely to flee, but easier to capture. Gen 1 being Gen 1, the actual mechanics are complicated and messy. Enough that I made an entire video dedicated to the utter craziness that is the Gen 1 Safari Zone. We also talk about the changes introduced in Pokémon Yellow. That's right, with the upgraded Special Pikachu Edition, the Safari Zone was modified as well. Basically, Pokémon are easier to catch due to being at a lower level, encounter tables were shuffled around, and a few Pokémon were added, but overall, the Safari Zone concept remains the same in Yellow. We come back to Kanto a few years later with the release of Pokémon Fire Red and Leaf Green, the Gen 1 remakes on the Game Boy Advance. The Safari Zone is also back, looking better than ever, and extremely similar to the Red and Blue version. Case in point with the new encounter tables being almost identical to the original games. Although there are a few modifications, or rather fixes, in Fire Red and Leaf Green's Safari Zone. First, we are given 100 more steps per visit, up to a total of 600 steps. Much better, as the key items we need to obtain require us to go through the entirety of the park in one go, which can be difficult if you don't already know the layout. Second, Area 1 is thankfully called Area 1. Last but not least, the underlying mechanics of Safari Zone encounters were completely reworked, making them a lot less frustrating to deal with. Indeed, Gen 3 cleans up a lot of the features and inner workings of the first 2 Pokémon generations. The code is easier to understand and makes more sense, which means it is also easier to explain. So let's dive in. Every Pokémon present in the Fire Red and Leaf Green Safari Zone has an exclusive to the Safari Zone catch rate and flee rate, which, as expected, determine our chances of a successful capture or a Pokémon escaping. Flee rate is simple. We have the chance to flee when a Pokémon is in a neutral state, or watching carefully, when a Pokémon is eating after throwing some bait, or when a Pokémon is angry after throwing a rock. The neutral and eating states are, on average, more advantageous in Gen 3 than in Gen 1, but the opposite is true for the angry state. More importantly, the flee rate is now consistent with the encountered Pokémon's rarity. Common Pokémon are unlikely to escape when angry, while rare ones instantly book it, and all Pokémon will rarely run away when eating. Catch chance is not that simple. The game takes the Pokémon's original catch rate, converts it to a unique Safari Zone catch rate, where it can be modified by bait and rocks, then converts it back to a normal catch rate to be used in the capture calculations. But these conversions ignore decimal numbers, resulting in drastically inaccurate results, and always lower than they should be. Funnily enough, because the remakes do not have to deal with the Gen 1 insane catch formula and the Game Boy's own inaccuracies, the Gen 3 Safari Zone's catch chances are not that bad, even with the terrible conversions. Where things get really interesting is when we try to modify the Safari Zone catch rate. Like in Gen 1, throwing bait halves the catch rate for 1 to 5 turns, while throwing a rock doubles it, and throwing several rocks or bait stack with themselves. Unlike Gen 1, the maximum amount of turns we can add is 6, the Safari Zone catch rate is never reset during combat, and most importantly, that number cannot be more than 20 when throwing a rock, or lower than 3 when throwing bait. Which leads us to the best strategy to catch rare Pokémon in the Fire Red and Leaf Green Safari Zone. Because the Safari Zone catch rate cannot exceed 20, throwing a rock at a Magikarp will not increase our catch chance. But by that same token, throwing bait at one of the rare Safari Pokémon will not decrease our catch chance either, as the catch rate cannot go below 3, and we still get the benefit of a significantly reduced flee chance. Even better, throwing bait at a Chansey increases its Safari Zone catch rate from 2 to 3, improving the catch chance from 4.9% to 8.1%. This means the Gen 3 bait is not only better than the Gen 1 version, it is actually the cornerstone of our strategy in the Fire Red and Leaf Green Safari Zone. This remade Safari ends up being a numbers game, like the original, but one that is in the player's favor, making it a much more enjoyable experience. Or it would be if it wasn't for the oversight. You know, that glitch, which seems to be a mandatory requirement to any old Pokémon game that completely messes with the mechanics and makes everything confusing? Fire Red and Leaf Greens goes like this. The all-important flee check of a Safari Pokémon is performed at the start of every turn, but uses the state of the Pokémon on the previous turn, before being affected by any bait or rock thrown. This means if a Pokémon goes back to watching carefully after eating or being angry, the flee check at the start of the next turn will be based on the Pokémon being neutral, regardless of what we did before the check. Basically, we have a 1-turn latency between throwing an item and said item affecting escape chance. The positive consequence is that we can attempt a Hail Mary by throwing a rock followed by a Safari Ball to take advantage of the improved catch chance before the Pokémon is angry and runs away. The absolutely terrible negative consequence is that the first escape attempt of any Pokémon will always use the neutral flee chance, as it is the default state at the start of combat. That's right, there is a 45% chance for every single rare Safari Pokémon to escape on their first attempt, and nothing we can do about it. But here's the best part. It doesn't matter. Because all these mechanics are hidden, you probably didn't know about this oversight, or the improvements to the original chances. As far as players are concerned, the Fire Red and Leaf Green Safari Zones look better, and Pokémon are slightly easier to catch, which means more Pokémon, which means more fun. It is that simple. The region of Kanto was revisited one extra time on the Switch with Pokémon Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee. This time though, the Safari Zone was absent, replaced with the Go Park, which is basically a Pokémon storage system for the mobile game Pokémon Go. It is rather sad that the last Kanto remake to release, for now, didn't feature one of its most iconic areas, but it is also completely understandable given the context of the Let's Go games. By the time the Yellow remakes were in development, the Safari Zone had already been replaced by other gimmicky features dedicated to capture. Being a link to the hottest thing the Pokémon franchise had released in years was a more important focus than adding an old and antiquated area. And so ends the tales of the Kanto Safari Zone. But what about other regions? The highly anticipated sequels to Red and Blue, Pokémon Gold and Silver, have no Safari Zone. Nada, zilch. Moving on. The Hoenn Safari Zone was introduced in... Okay, there's more to this story. There's the Beta Safari Zone, the Safari replacement in the bug catching contest, and Pokémon Hard Gold and Soul Silver's... thing. But let's just put a pin on it for now. I promise we'll come back to Johto. The Hoenn Safari Zone was introduced in Ruby and Sapphire on the Game Boy Advance. Like previously mentioned, Gen 3 was the opportunity for Pokémon games to start fresh, and fix most of the previous game's shortcomings. Among the many attempted improvements was a brand new Safari Zone, located on Route 121. Unlike the Kanto version, this area is completely optional and does not feature any key items or HMs. To gain access to the entrance, we first need to go to the Slateport City Contest Hall on the other side of Hoenn and obtain the Pokéblock case. This unlocks access to the Safari Zone, and like Gen 1, our visit is limited to 500 steps with 30 Safari Balls for a price of 500 flags. See, I've always called the Pokémon currency Pokédollars, but this name is never actually used in the core Pokémon games. The reason for that is simple. The Japanese games just use yen as its currency. The Gen 3 games, Pokémon Colosseum and XD Gale of Darkness, are the exception, where the currency is called Pokédollar in Japanese, localized into Pokémon Dollar. But those games are not part of the core series and were not even developed by Game Freak. Regardless, I will still use the term Pokédollar because it is fun and I'm used to it. Also, the symbol for this made-up currency is close to the very real Russian ruble. Back to the Safari Zone. The Hoenn version is split into 4 distinct areas, except the areas are not properly defined or named this time. The northwest area, starting from the entrance, is only accessible using the Mac Bike, while the north area requires the Acro Bike. The Pokémon available to us in all the areas are more limited in number compared to Gen 1, and none are new Gen 3 additions. Also, the numerous items found in Kanto are replaced with trainers ready to provide color commentary and hints on the Safari Zone. Finally, there are Pokémon feeders spread all over the park that we can fill with Pokéblocks. These Pokéblock are the most drastic change between the Kanto and Hoenn Safari Zones, and feed directly into the new way Safari encounters work in Hoenn. In Ruby and Sapphire, our options against a wild Safari Pokémon are to either throw a Safari Ball, throw a Pokéblock, or approach the Pokémon. Throwing a Pokéblock can make the Pokémon less likely to flee, while getting closer to our target increases our catch chance while making the Pokémon more likely to flee. How effective a Pokéblock is depends on its taste and the nature of the Pokémon encountered. Every nature has a liked and disliked flavor. Either the Safari Pokémon likes that flavor and is enthralled, dislikes it and ignores the Pokéblock, or doesn't mind it and is curious. and the Pokemon's nature can be influenced. Any Pokemon encountered around a Pokéblock feeder will have a nature dependent on the flavor of the block put inside. The numbers themselves are a bit messy, but this still gives us more control in the Safari Zone, and that is fantastic. How about the catching mechanics though? Because Fire Red and Leaf Green's Safari Zone is based on Ruby and Sapphire, we already understand part of the inner workings of the Hoenn Safari Zone. We have Safari Zone specific catch and flee rates, and these are modified by our actions in combat, their impact being less and less powerful depending on the amount of time they are repeated, as seen in this table. This table shows us the Hoenn Safari Zone is much better designed than the Kanto one. First, our catch chance can only go up, not down, so our chances of capture can never become ridiculously low. Second, the changes are incremental, meaning we have better control over the risk taken. We can decide how safe we want to play. No insane jumps in fleet chances anymore. Overall, the Hoenn Safari Zone is an improvement over the Kanto Safari Zone. Sure, the Pokemon available are low in number and not super exciting, but the mechanics are better, and more control is given to the player. Remember though, we are playing an old Pokemon game. That's right, it's time for the Oversight. This time, we are looking at the Safari Flee chance. This number has a maximum of 20, which results in a 100% escape chance, and a minimum of 1, for a 5% escape chance. At the start of combat, every Safari Pokemon starts at 3. If we lower that number below 0, it will become 1. If the number is 1, it cannot be lowered anymore. If that number is 0, no problem. The flee chance needs to be negative to be corrected. So, if we can lower that number to 0 while avoiding 1, we will have a Pokemon with literally 0% chance to escape. So here is the best strategy to catch Pokemon in the Hoenn Safari Zone. We want to turn the default Safari flee rate from 3 to 0. On the first turn, we can achieve that by throwing a Pokéblock the Pokemon is neutral about. If we're lucky with natures, the Pokemon is curious, and at this point, it will never escape. We can throw Safari Balls until we're out. Easy. But remember, we can influence natures with Pokéblock feeders. So, if we put a bitter Pokéblock into the feeder, then throw a spicy Pokéblock, we have an 86.63% chance for the Pokemon to feel neutral about the taste. Even better, if the Pokemon ignores the first Pokéblock, we can still get a -3 by throwing a Pokéblock it likes during the second turn. And with the feeder, we already know what flavor it is more likely to enjoy. With this knowledge, we can completely trivialize the Safari hunt in Ruby and Sapphire, which is not very exciting, considering our limited selection of Pokemon. But this strategy also works in Emerald, and this game added a lot more species to the Safari Zone. All the new additions are from Gen 2, and were supposed to appear in the Altering Cave on Route 103 and Fire Red and Leaf Green's Savvy Islands. They were instead added to the eastern extension to the Hoenn Safari Zone, which unlocks after completing the Hall of Fame and acquiring the National Pokédex. This is the only change brought by Emerald, but it makes the Safari Zone roster much more interesting, although still lacking in powerful rare Pokémon. Unfortunately, this extension was completely ignored in Pokémon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. In fact, the whole Safari concept was removed from the game. The Safari Zone area still exists, but the layout is completely remade, and it now acts as a simple side area containing numerous TMs and the unique Absolite. There are no Safari Balls or Pokéblock feeders, just the normal Pokemon encounters where we fight using our own team. Even the encounter tables completely ignore Emerald, and instead keep the disappointingly light Ruby and Sapphire versions. Like in Kanto, It is clear the developers had absolutely no interest in coming back to the Safari Zone concept when remaking Hoenn. But why? With a franchise willing to keep features and tradition sometimes to a fault, why didn't the Safari Zone make the cut? Having explored the Kanto and Hoenn Safari Zone and their evolution, we know why. All the underlying mechanics, strategies, and improvements are neat, but completely hidden from the player. If the core gameplay is dictated by arbitrary mechanics that are concealed while being barely explained, they become extremely difficult to understand and interact with. Or simply put, it's not fun. Pokémon is already full of randomness. Adding a new area with more of it isn't the way to go. For the average player, the best way to deal with the Safari Zone is to either throw Safari Balls only or just ignore the area altogether, something even the developers eventually decided to do. Except Game Freak did not give up on the Safari Zone just yet. The concept was dropped in Gen 5, which leaves us with Gen 4. Remember that Johto pin? Gen 4 featured not one, but 2 brand new Safari Zone with the Great March in Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum, and the Johto Safari Zone in Heart Gold and Soul Silver. 2 attempts at nailing the concept. 2 attempts that ended with the Safari Zone being discarded for good. What happened that was so horrible, so atrocious, that made Game Freak give up on the whole idea? Let's learn why together in the 3rd and final installment of our impromptu trilogy of Safari Zone videos, where we will dive into the Gen 4 games, the Great March, and the final attempt at the elusive Safari concept, the infamous Heart Gold and Soul Silver Safari Zone. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. The original plan was to put all the Safari Zone information into a single video, but like a lot of Pokemon things, the moment I started digging, I found so much information I had to separate it into several different scripts. And all this work is made possible thanks to the support of fantastic people on Ko-fi, including YLambda, JCBTV, and SCJ643. I am very much looking forward to the Gen 4 video, and I hope you are too. Thank you for your time, and I wish you a wonderful day.